You snapped at someone today, and the worst part is you already knew in real time that it was not really about them. The anger was already loaded before they said a single word. Marcus Aurelius found the cure for exactly this. 3 techniques you can use tonight to stop the cycle. Picture this. You are sitting in traffic, running 5 minutes late, and the person in front of you does not move when the light turns green. That half-second pause detonates something inside you that feels wildly out of proportion to a green light. The real fix is not breathing exercises or counting to 10. It is something more counterintuitive, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Around 170 AD, on the freezing Danube frontier, an emperor sat by lamplight after his soldiers had gone to sleep and wrote private notes to himself. Marcus Aurelius was managing a grinding war, a court full of flatterers and backstabbers, and his own daily irritation at people who were lazy, dishonest, or simply slow. He was not a calm man by nature. He was a man who worked hard every single day on a specific set of mental techniques. He wrote those notes in a journal he called roughly Things to Himself. We call it the Meditations. He never intended anyone else to read it. That matters because he was not performing wisdom for an audience. He was debugging his own anger in real time, and the methods he developed are surgical in a way that general advice simply is not. The core insight running through all 3 techniques is this. Anger almost never lives in the event itself. It lives in the interpretation you attach to the event, and interpretations can be changed. That sounds simple. The techniques are what make it actually work when your heart rate is up and your jaw is tight. Technique 1 is called the pause and name. Here's the mechanic in one sentence. The moment you feel the anger spike, you stop all outward action and you silently name what is physically happening in your body. Not the story, not the blame, just the physical sensation. Marcus Aurelius writes in the Meditations that the first move is to recognize the impression before you act on it. He calls it holding back assent. What that means practically is that the feeling arrives and you do not immediately fuse with it. You notice it the way you would notice a weather change. Something is happening in here. Here's exactly what you do tonight. The next time you feel that spike, whether it is in a conversation, in traffic, or reading a message on your phone, you say one silent sentence to yourself. My chest is tight and my breath is short. That is it. No analysis, no judgment, just a physical description. That single act interrupts the automatic chain between trigger and reaction. The reason this works is not mystical. When you name a physical sensation, you shift cognitive load from the emotional processing center to the observing part of the brain. Marcus Aurelius understood this functionally even without the neuroscience. He wrote that passions lose most of their force the moment you step back and describe them rather than inhabit them. Most people try to argue themselves out of anger while they are still inside it. That never works because the rational brain is partially offline when the emotional spike is at its peak. The pause and name technique does not ask you to reason. It asks you to observe. That is a request your brain can actually fulfill in the moment. Practice this once tonight before you need it. Recall the last thing that made you angry this week and describe only the physical sensations you remember. Where was it in your body? What did your breathing do? What happened in your shoulders? You are training the reflex in a low-stakes moment so it is available in a high-stakes one. But the pause and name only stops the immediate explosion. It does not dissolve the underlying charge that keeps reloading. That is where the second technique does something the first one cannot. Technique 2 is called Reclassification. The mechanic: you take the story you are telling about why you are angry and you deliberately replace the judgment word with a neutral description. This is where the method actually clicks because it targets the fuel source, not just the flame. Marcus Aurelius uses this technique explicitly throughout the Meditations. He writes that we should strip away the description that flatters or inflames and look at the bare thing itself. His example is a famous one. A purple robe is sheep's wool stained with shellfish blood. He is not saying the robe is ugly. He is saying the word magnificent is something you added, and you can remove it. Apply this to anger. When a colleague interrupts you in a meeting, the story is, they are disrespecting me. They think I am not worth listening to. They always do this. The reclassification is, a person spoke before I finished my sentence. That is the bare event. Everything else is an interpretation you layered on top. Here is the concrete practice for tonight. Think of one recurring anger trigger in your life, the type of situation that reliably gets you. Write 2 columns in a notebook or on your phone. Left column, the story you tell about it, with all the judgment words. Right column, only what physically and observably happened, with no judgment words at all. Read both columns. The gap between them is where your anger actually lives. This is not the same as saying the other person was right. Reclassification does not require you to excuse the behavior. It requires you to separate the observable fact from the meaning you assigned to it, because the meaning is what keeps you awake at 2 a.m. rehearsing the argument. The fact alone does not do that. Marcus Aurelius notes that most of what enrages us involves our own opinion of what should have happened. The colleague should have waited. The driver should have moved. The partner should have known. Every should is a judgment you wrote. Every judgment you wrote, you can also revise. Once you have reclassified the event, you will often find that about 60% of the anger simply loses its grip. What remains is usually something worth addressing directly and calmly. That is actually progress. Anger at that level is information. The amplified version was just noise. There is a third layer, though, and skipping it is why many people find the first 2 techniques work for a week and then fade. The third technique is called the Goodwill Reset, and it runs in the morning, not in the moment of conflict. Technique 3 is the Goodwill Reset. The mechanic, each morning, before you interact with anyone, you spend 60 seconds deliberately remembering that the people who will frustrate you today are not your enemies. They are people trying to navigate their own confusion, exactly the way you are navigating yours. Marcus Aurelius opens one of the most striking passages in the Meditations by saying that at dawn, he prepares himself to meet interference, ingratitude, insolence, and disloyalty. He does not do this to become resigned. He does it so that none of these things can surprise him into a reaction he has not chosen. Preparation is not pessimism, it is the opposite of naivety. He goes further. He writes that those people who will irritate him are his kin, not by blood but by shared rational nature. They are mistaken, not malicious. He explicitly says that a person does wrong because they do not understand, not because they have chosen to target you personally. That reframe changes the emotional tone of every interaction before it begins. The concrete practice is 60 seconds. Tomorrow morning, before you pick up your phone, before you check messages, you sit for 1 minute and you name the 2 or 3 people most likely to irritate you today. For each one, you say silently, this person is doing their best with what they understand right now. You do not have to believe it completely. You just have to plant it before the day loads the gun. What the Goodwill Reset does is lower the baseline. The pause and name and the reclassification both work on the spike. The Goodwill Reset reduces how high the spike starts from. When your baseline assumption about people is benign confusion rather than hostile intent, the trigger threshold shifts, less fires. When something does fire, it fires smaller. Used together, these 3 techniques operate at 3 different points in the anger cycle: the morning before conflict, the moment of the spike, and the story you tell afterward that either dissolves the charge or keeps it burning. Marcus Aurelius used all 3 as a daily system, not as emergency interventions. Now here is the common pitfall, the misreading that causes people to abandon all 3 of these techniques within a week. And it is worth spending a moment here because it will likely feel familiar. The misreading is this: people use these techniques as suppression tools. They pause, they name, they reclassify, and then they swallow the anger and say nothing. They mistake the techniques for a method of becoming silent and compliant. Marcus Aurelius is completely explicit that this is not what he means. He writes that right action sometimes requires confrontation. The goal is not to stop responding. The goal is to stop reacting. The difference between responding and reacting is this: a reaction happens to you. A response is chosen by you. These techniques do not tell you to accept bad treatment. They clear enough space between the trigger and your action that what you do next is actually yours. That is a very different thing from suppression, and confusing the two will make the whole system feel like emotional imprisonment rather than freedom. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. He gave orders that had life and death consequences. He was not practicing passivity. He was practicing the discipline of not letting someone else's behavior determine his inner state while still acting with full force when action was required. That distinction is the entire point. So let's place these 3 techniques in sequence for the rest of your week. Tonight, do the 2-column reclassification exercise on one recurring anger trigger. Tomorrow morning, do 60 seconds of the Goodwill Reset before you touch your phone. Then, at the first moment of genuine irritation tomorrow, deploy the pause and name. Just those 3 actions in that order. What Marcus Aurelius found, and what you will find, is that these are not techniques for becoming a calmer, more agreeable version of yourself. They are techniques for becoming a more accurate version of yourself, one who acts on reality rather than on the amplified, story-laden version of reality that anger manufactures. The anger that lives in you right now is not irrational. It is tracking something real. These methods do not erase it. They refine it until what remains is the signal, clean and usable, and the noise has been stripped away. That signal might still point to a hard conversation, a boundary, or a decision, but you will make that move from a place you actually chose. On the Danube frontier by lamplight, a man who commanded the largest army in the world wrote notes reminding himself that no one can injure you without your interpretation granting them access. He wrote it to himself because he needed the reminder. So do you. So does everyone. That is not a weakness. That is simply what it means to work on something difficult. The 3 techniques are not a promise that you will never be angry again. They are a promise that the anger will increasingly be something you are holding rather than something that is holding you. That shift, however small it is at first, is the entire foundation Marcus Aurelius was building toward in those private notes. If this gave you one tool you can use tonight, subscribe. There's a new Stoic technique here every week. Once you can manage your own anger cycle, you will hit the next wall, the people closest to you who drain and exhaust you in ways that feel completely different. That is exactly what the next video covers. Family that drains you. What Marcus Aurelius did,